June 6, 1944, and a grey dawn breaks over the English Channel, revealing a sight mankind had never witnessed before. 7,000 vessels carrying 130,000 men, protected by 20,000 aircraft circling overhead like steel angels. At first light, after a hellish bombardment, these men would storm the beaches of France. Another 20,000 would drop from the sky. By day's end, 10,500 Allied soldiers would be dead, and nearly as many Germans. 11 weeks later, Paris would be free and the road to Berlin would lie open. This is their story, told through the eyes of both sides, the planners in their war rooms and the anonymous heroes who lived it, including men like Sergeant Grant, who risked everything to film it. December 1st, 1943, Tehran. 3 men who held the fate of the world in their hands had just made a decision that would change everything. At the top of the conference steps stood Joseph Stalin, supreme leader of the Soviet Union, looking satisfied. Below him, Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, appeared far less pleased. For 2 years, these 3 leaders had argued about when to open a second front in Western Europe. Stalin had been demanding it since Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941. His forces were bleeding out in the east, facing Hitler alone, and he needed relief. But Churchill was terrified of a frontal assault on Germany. He'd convinced the Americans to take the long way around through North Africa, then up through Italy, hoping to weaken the Axis from the south. It hadn't worked. They'd gotten stuck near Naples, nowhere close to Germany. Roosevelt had hesitated for a long time. He didn't think America was ready for such a massive operation. But now he wanted to end the Third Reich as quickly as possible, and he wanted to do it in the West. He also hoped to maintain good relations with the Soviets after victory. Churchill had no choice but to accept. Since America entered the war in 1941, Hitler had been obsessed with an invasion of occupied Western Europe. In 1942, he launched a colossal project, the Atlantic Wall, a continuous line of fortifications stretching nearly 4,000 miles from northern Norway to the Spanish border. Despite most Germans believing any attack would come at Calais, just 25 miles from Britain, Hitler wasn't taking chances. He requisitioned thousands of workers, French conscripts, refugees, Jews, and prisoners of war to build this monstrosity, consuming 13 million tons of concrete. By late 1943, Fortress Europe seemed impregnable. January 15, 1944. Dwight Eisenhower, handpicked by Roosevelt to lead the invasion, arrived in London to plan Operation Overlord. "The stage is being set for the great and crucial test," he announced to the world. "I am completely confident that the soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the United Nations will demonstrate once and for all that an aroused democracy is the most formidable fighting machine that can be devised." Days later, Eisenhower introduced his team to the press. As American Supreme Commander, he needed a British deputy. He chose General Bernard Montgomery, hero of the North African campaign against Rommel, beloved by his countrymen, and never one to shy from the spotlight. At the press conference, the military leaders posed before a deliberately faded, illegible map. Montgomery played to the cameras while his colleagues gestured meaninglessly at nothing. All theatre. Because in truth, they'd already chosen their target, Normandy, not Calais. The beaches were farther from Britain but far less defended. The invasion was planned for spring, between Ouistreham and Carrington, at the base of the Cotentin Peninsula. Montgomery pushed to widen the front to include Caen, ensuring they wouldn't get trapped in a small beachhead. He also wanted to extend west toward Cherbourg's deep water port, essential for supplying the massive army that would follow. Secrecy was everything. The Germans needed to remain completely in the dark. Early 1944, they still had no idea where the invasion would come. Time to fire up the propaganda machine and keep them guessing. Eisenhower's arrival in London confirmed Hitler's worst fears. Back in 1942, he'd appointed one of his most brilliant commanders to prepare for this moment, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, who'd humiliated the British again and again in North Africa. Now Hitler tasked this energetic officer with reinforcing Fortress Europe's defences. By early 1944, Rommel was in France inspecting the coastline. With the Luftwaffe stationed in Germany to counter Allied bombing, he couldn't count on air support in Normandy. The battle would be won or lost on the beaches, which he found woefully unprepared. Rommel wanted a continuous defensive line, not just fortified towns. He demanded more mines. But one mine seemed laughable. When you considered that from Calais to Lower Brittany, France had 750 miles of coastline to defend. Rommel's frantic energy didn't worry Eisenhower much. For months, the British and Americans had been building something extraordinary, artificial harbours. They wouldn't need to capture a real port immediately, giving them flexibility to choose their attack point. Massive concrete caissons called phoenixes would be towed to the Normandy coast and sunk to form breakwaters. Floating docks would unload tons of equipment and thousands of men connected to enormous steel pontoons providing beach access regardless of tide levels. A gigantic construction project assembled in Britain's ports. Meanwhile, training continued. British and American forces tested everything, though much of it was staged for cameras, synchronized swimming meets and pyrotechnics, anti-mine tanks to clear beaches, special matting to cross sand more easily, Churchill crocodile flamethrower tanks that would incinerate anything the bombers missed. The Allies had already lost several hundred men in training exercises alone. Why train in the harshest conditions in deepest Cornwall? Because every possible scenario had to be anticipated. And Americans never went into battle without overwhelming force on their side. Boys from Utah, Kansas, Ohio, Kentucky, how many of them could even find Britain or France on a map? How many suspected what awaited them on Normandy's beaches? By February 1944, over 800,000 American servicemen were in Britain, with more arriving daily. British women greeted them with the inevitable donut, a first taste of sweetness, maybe more if things heated up. America kept sending equipment, Sherman tanks designed to match Germany's fearsome panzers. Locals in small grey English towns marvelled at the P-38 bombers with their superior range. Making room for these newcomers wasn't easy. Families had to be evacuated from their homes while tearful children watched. Stereotypes hardened between the poor old British bloke and his spoiled American cousin, especially since the GI's rations far exceeded anything the British could eat. Still, good relations developed, particularly in seaside resorts like Blackpool, where American servicemen relaxed off duty, much to local girls' delight and probably their absent husbands' dismay. Never in British history had there been so many divorces and illegitimate births. But this was war, and fraternization was the order of the day. More than jiving was needed to win hearts, though. Eisenhower had always respected his allies. In March, he visited Sandhurst Military Academy, where young Churchill had studied, to tell cadets what would be expected of them. "You young men have this war to win," he told them. "You must know every single one of your men. It's not enough to be the best soldier, the strongest, the toughest. You must be their leader, their father and mentor. Then you will be worthy of the traditions of this great school and your great country." These young Brits were barely in their 20s. Ike spoke with his characteristic warmth, knowing some would soon die fighting for a country that had spent 4 years proudly resisting the Nazis. That same month, Churchill attended a full-scale training exercise with American paratroopers, Ike at his side. British newsreel producers went all out with onboard cameras. Not for the cigar, you'd think it was real. Churchill even had his own camera, and a smile to boot. Later filmmakers would use this training footage to represent the actual Normandy drops, which were never filmed. More importantly, Churchill was now fully behind Operation Overlord despite his initial resistance. While the Allies united in Britain, Hitler remained far from operations at his eastern headquarters near the Soviet front, still playing divide and conquer. In the west, he split German command between Marshal von Rundstedt, chief of the Western Front, and Rommel, chief of coastal defense. The two men disagreed fundamentally. Von Rundstedt wanted armored divisions inland so they could converge after the Allies landed. Rommel believed British and American aviation would paralyze German troop movements. He wanted armor close to the coast to hit the enemy during landing. His wishes were rejected. So Rommel focused on beach defenses, installing anti-tank obstacles, anti-landing craft barriers, and chevaux de frise built from old railroad tracks, making advance nearly impossible. He even altered terrain to impede paratroop landings. Where possible, the Germans intentionally flooded land just inside the coast, Devon, southwest England. American infantry training for beach landings at cliff bases where enemies might be stationed. First priority, establish a beachhead below the cliff. Set up radio communications for following waves. Dig in for shelter. But to save your skin, young soldier, you'll need more enthusiasm. Wait for the right moment to collect equipment and attend the wounded. What if on D-Day it's impossible to dig in on a pebble beach? What if low tide means staying pinned down, unable to reach the wounded? Like on the future Omaha beach, so similar to this Devon training ground, where Americans would lose 3,000 men. The reason this beach resembled the real thing so closely was because the Allies knew exactly what to expect. For weeks, aided by the French resistance facing brutal repression, they'd accessed thousands of photos of German defenses. Protected or not, the entire Channel coast had been studied meticulously. Everything spotted, everything noted. All intelligence collected, analyzed, integrated into the attack plan. Still top secret, of course, except for the tons of disinformation fed to the Germans. For months, the Allies had been spoon-feeding false intelligence to lure them toward different landing sites, particularly Calais. In Britain, the ploy continued with fake airfields opposite the Calais coast, fields of inflatable airplanes sprouting up. Meanwhile, in southern England, where most troops assembled, supplies, weapons and ammunition remained well camouflaged. By May, concealing the operations in Normandy was impossible. Hundreds of thousands of men moved into camps closer to embarkation points, isolated from locals to prevent leaks. Officers worried about morale went easy on usual discipline. At one RAF squadron, they decided not to clip their pilots' wings before they'd fly off to crush the German eagle in the Normandy countryside. Among all these men, forever unseen, were those who filmed everything. Students from the British Army Film School, all volunteers entrusted with capturing the preparations for posterity. The youngest among them, 20-year-old Desmond O'Neill, was determined to cover D-Day. Like his colleagues, he'd been made sergeant, the ideal rank to stay close to the men. "My camera was welcome," he'd say later. It distracted them. May 27th. His fellow soldiers received new currency, French francs printed by the Allies, much to General de Gaulle's anger. He saw it as breaching French sovereignty. For the moment, he remained out of the loop, barely aware of what was planned. "These men knew they had a good chance of being killed," O'Neill would remark. It created a strange mood. Another Army cameraman was 27-year-old Sergeant Ian Grant. Always wearing his Scottish beret, he'd chosen the film corps to escape boring duties and immortalize his brothers in arms. May 31st. Grant filmed them receiving booklets about the country they'd soon invade. "That's when we first learned our target was Normandy," he'd say later. He filmed the extra rations being distributed as they prepared to face the worst. It was now a matter of days. June the 1st. Norman Clague, a cameraman who sadly left us only his clapperboard, filmed final instructions being given to his company. He filmed from above, already taking risks, careful not to reveal where they'd be landing. Even they barely knew where Ouistreham was. Everything remained top secret. They'd been in perfect isolation for 2 weeks. The cards were dealt. Clague and his fellow cameramen headed to the ports and the start of their great adventure. The US Army was perfectly equipped. With 1.5 million men, American servicemen in southern England outnumbered their British counterparts. In early June, hundreds of thousands left their camps before gathered locals who'd come to see off their new heroes, all heading to various embarkation points, 19 ports on England's south coast. British troops embarked in the east, Americans in the west. The next time they'd leave these ships would be to land. Canadians under British command, the third largest Allied force, provided 21,000 men, reversing 20,000 vehicles into ship holds so they could drive onto beaches as quickly as possible was a remarkable feat, not to mention thousands of tons of supplies needed for the first 2 days. To maximize success, Eisenhower considered several parameters: a full moon night for visibility and half tide at dawn for landings. In June, only the 5th, 6th, or 7th would work. To catch the enemy by surprise earlier was better. Ike chose June 5th, but days before the 5th, weather worsened. June 4th, as ships from northern England headed for the Channel, a violent storm broke. Eisenhower had to recall all vessels already at sea. Operation Overlord was threatened. Any movements might have alerted the Germans. Day and night, Ike and his team stayed in constant contact with the weather office. The news wasn't good. Forecasts were poor for the next 2 weeks. That would spell disaster. Men would need remotivating. The campaign would be shortened by 2 weeks. In ports where Eisenhower delayed departure, waiting became unbearable as landing craft circled endlessly like crocodiles in a waterhole. June 4th, Desmond O'Neill worked among fellow Brits of the 3rd Division in relentless wind. "We just sat there with nothing to do but eat or smoke," he observed. "We didn't lack food. I had 10 men's rations just for me." A mood of bitter disappointment came over us. We still didn't know where we were going, only that we'd crossed the Channel. Later we learned we'd land at Lyon-sur-Mer. It meant nothing to any of us. Canadians, known for devout Christianity, prayed hard for help they'd soon need. Never had religious services been so well attended as on Sunday, June 4th, 1944, in all southern England ports. Americans tried staying busy, knowing nothing fatigued men like idleness, making them more vulnerable on the big day. Evening of June the 4th. The weather forecast was slightly less pessimistic. Calmer seas predicted for the 5th and 6th. That night, in 30 minutes, Eisenhower made a decision that would change the world's course. The fleet would sail June 6, 1944, June 5th. The massive machine's wheels began turning. Allied planes attacked northern and western France to prevent German reinforcements reaching Normandy. Allied bombers were indiscriminate. They struck lower Normandy for 3 full days, claiming nearly 4,000 German and civilian lives. The raids sparked heated discussions between Eisenhower and Churchill, who worried about French hatred they'd generate. Surprisingly, the French resistance replied, "This is war. We must accept people will die." June 3rd in Algiers, General de Gaulle had transformed the French Committee of National Liberation into the Provisional Government of the French Republic. Until then, he'd been kept silent. The Allies had concealed everything from the French. As France's liberation approached, British and Americans needed de Gaulle to ensure full cooperation from civilians and the resistance. June the 4th. Summoned by Churchill, de Gaulle left for Britain intent on speaking his mind. He refused to let the Allies dictate terms. Despite their refusal to grant him full power, the sensitive general agreed to back Overlord. June 5th at sea, diversionary tactics continued. Dozens of small ships headed north of Le Havre, funnels billowing steam as smokescreen, and to make Germans believe a huge fleet was crossing toward positions far north of targeted Normandy beaches. Eisenhower always believed a leader's place was alongside his men before enduring battle. Late afternoon, June the 5th, at Greenham Common Airfield, hours before takeoff, he visited the U.S. 101st Airborne Division. They'd be among first to reach French soil. Ike's smiling face masked underlying tension, all the more reason for paratroopers to put on brave faces and reassure their leader. That evening, Eisenhower stayed until the end, until the last plane took off. Farther away, without their leader there to cheer them, reconnaissance paratroopers found their own way to show courage. Real Redskins, or just white men's myth of Native American warriors, their scarlet war paint helped these 20-something Iroquois prepare for action. Those without war paint blackened faces with charcoal to be less visible. Besides weapons and parachutes, these men jumped with radio transmitters to signal marked zones where gliders could drop most troops. 3 men were needed to help one paratrooper aboard who had a 50% survival chance and knew it. That same night, Ike wrote a letter in case landings ended in disaster, proof the Allies were certain of nothing. My decision to attack at this time and place was based on the best information available. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone. For weeks, the Allies had perfected a well-established plan. During the night of June the 5th, German coastal defenses would be bombed. Naval artillery would start firing at dawn from 45 miles offshore. British and Canadians would take the right flank, assigned 3 beaches, Sword, Juno, and Gold, located between Ouistreham and Arromanches. Americans would take the left with Omaha and Utah beaches. The British needed to capture Caen quickly. The city was a vital communication hub through which Germans could bring reinforcements. It opened onto flat land, allowing Allied armor to spread and planes to land at temporary airfields. Americans would move to Cherbourg, which they planned to capture within a week, so hundreds of thousands more men could land with materials for the next offensive stage. June the 6th. From 3:15 a.m., Allied planes began bombing German positions across every landing sector. At dawn, naval artillery took over to smash the Atlantic Wall. Omaha Beach near the Cotentin was first objective. Americans had to quickly establish a beachhead, then join colleagues at Utah before heading toward Cherbourg together. Many aerial bombardments arrived too soon or too late, missing targets. Naval artillery didn't fare better. The early landing hour, determined by tide, didn't give enough time to successfully pulverize the Atlantic Wall. Main attack fell to experienced GIs of the Big Red One, but attached to them was the 116th Battalion, young men who'd never been under fire. To stay out of enemy fire range, landing craft were released onto rough seas too far from coast. Men were crammed like pack animals. Robert Capa, the only photographer present, said, "When the first shell's noise hit our ears, we hit the deck and lay in our vomit without watching the coast approach." Barely on the beach, men were greeted by an almost intact German defense. It was a turkey shoot. Wind brought the tide earlier than forecast. Following attack waves floundered on Rommel's sea defenses, forcing men to leave craft in deep water. Unable to advance, they grouped in the beach center, pinned down by enemy artillery. More like crucified, as shown by Capa's few remaining photos. The rest were accidentally destroyed. Strong currents swept landing craft off course. Men drowned as equipment weight dragged them down. The sea turned red. Omaha Beach would be called Bloody Omaha. U.S. command considered calling off the offensive. A desperate measure meaning abandoning those already landed to their fate. Hundreds were already dead and wounded. Their sacrifice would have been in vain. Stopping would open a huge breach in the Allied front just as the gigantic war machine moved to full throttle. Morning of June 6th. Daybreak revealed an armada of 7,000 vessels approaching the Normandy coast. As always, Ike wasn't far away. At 9:45 a.m., he spoke to the world via BBC. "I call upon all who love freedom to stand with us now. Keep your faith staunch. Our arms are resolute. Together we shall achieve victory." Across a 45-mile front, there was practically one boat every 250 meters with air cover from 11,000 planes, all painted with white stripes so Allied artillery wouldn't mistakenly fire at them. Fortunately, not every sector resembled Omaha. Germans had been taken in by Allied disinformation, still believing main attack would come at Calais, and were having trouble regrouping. The unbreakable Atlantic Wall began crumbling, as did German anti-aircraft defenses. Allied aviation imperiously flew 10,000 sorties that day. As B-26s released last bombs inland, fighter planes entered action. Coastal defenses were targeted, airfields too, keeping enemy planes grounded. Communication hubs, roads, bridges, railways, all systematically destroyed. The French resistance, having completed intelligence and sabotage missions, now attacked, attempting to stop Germans bringing reinforcements to the front. Combined Allied and resistance action meant German troops summoned from Brittany and south of the Loire had trouble advancing. Rommel, who from the outset wanted men positioned close to beaches to counter invasion, had been proved right. The British 3rd Infantry Division headed for Sword. Mission: neutralize defences at Ouistreham and take Caen the same day. The Scotsman of the 45th Commando Royal Marines, filmed by Sergeant Ian Grant, would land at Ouistreham. He wrote, "This was the real thing. I filmed the gigantic fleet as best I could, more or less at sea level. We'd been given good rations and seasickness pills, but with diesel fumes, most men, even the strongest, got sick. The sky was black with planes. Some flew at low altitude so we could be told specific types over loudspeakers and tell them apart from enemy planes. We told men to ignore cameras as much as possible. They were natural actors deep in their thoughts, living their own experiences. I wasn't afraid because there was no fear on their faces. Just the desire to get out of that bloody boat making them seasick. The closer we got to beach, the more deafening the noise became. In the rush, a ramp broke. Everyone converged on the remaining gangplank. You just had to get off as best you could with your backpack's weight pulling you down." Grant and the others were spared the first assault. For them, the hard part was about to begin. Joining paratroopers dropped behind enemy lines. Another cameraman was already on Sword Beach. The youngest among them, Sergeant O'Neill, had arrived 45 minutes before Grant. He filmed the battle's last moments. In that grey smoke, everything seemed unreal. It wasn't a battle you could imagine or see in movies. The beach exits were congested. It was nearly impossible to get off. I followed an infantry platoon trying to escape. At this point, the jolting camera indicates O'Neill was shot. He had just enough time to film last sequences before being repatriated for medical care. Farewell, Sergeant O'Neill, and well done to all your comrades who captured Sword that day at a cost of 600 dead and wounded, all lost in the mass of unknowns, most barely 20 years old. Germans taken prisoner were rounded up on beaches. A few miles from Sword, Juno Beach in the Canadian sector. Mission: take Caen Airport. What were these young soldiers thinking after making the 5,000-mile journey to land at Bernières, a small, unknown Normandy seaside resort? This is footage of the first attack wave, the only one filmed during landings but by an automatic camera fixed to the landing craft. Yet even the cold eye of a mechanical camera captures a simple human gesture. Soon, the very first French house would be liberated in Normandy. It would cost 100 men's lives, which Allied cameramen were asked not to film. Better to focus on first German prisoners and anger one proud Frenchman showed them. German surrender didn't mask difficulties on Juno Beach, where rough seas caused problems for the second assault wave. 300 young Canadians lost their lives. The sacrifice wasn't in vain. With the beachhead established, surviving colleagues began advancing inland toward Caen. Already the first reward, young French women delighted at seeing their country liberated by these men, many speaking French, albeit with funny accents. Yet at Allied headquarters in Portsmouth, despite British Admiral Ramsay smiling with pride at his fleet's role, Eisenhower still seemed anxious. Since dawn he'd been receiving message after message, some alarming like those from Omaha, some encouraging like those from Utah or the British sector. From Ike's face you could tell the battle wasn't yet won. 6 hours after landing at Omaha, the boys were still stuck at the cliff's foot. Americans always did best for their men, whatever extra backup required. Even first assault waves were accompanied by an experienced medical corps ready to take immediate care of wounded, including the enemy. Never had first aid been so needed as at Bloody Omaha, where dead lay alongside a handful of prisoners. 3,000 Americans lost their lives on the deadliest of 5 beaches. Yet late in the day, with sun out and after first waves managed to establish beachheads and advance inland, more troops began arriving at Omaha. At last, it was possible to say the landing succeeded. Now on to the next battle for Normandy and France, General Montgomery arrived 2 days later with cause for concern. Always wanting crushing balance of power before taking action, he delayed deploying armored divisions and couldn't take Caen as supposed on day 1. Moreover, his troops, relieved at having landed without too much damage, seemed to lack bite. Their cameramen embodied this, strolling around filming funny Frenchmen asked to pose. These ones seemed happy to oblige. June 8th, Norman Clague, the man with a clapperboard, filmed first moments of peace when German prisoners and wounded no longer feared their yesterday's enemies. 5 days later, Clague would be killed by German fire. With him, compassion and morbidity were never far apart. But this footage also illustrates how the British slackened off the day after D-Day, a slackening Germans would exploit. Though German forces held back from the front, as von Rundstedt ordered, couldn't reinforce colleagues on coasts, they now reacted. 2 armoured divisions, including the famous 12th Panzer Hitlerjugend SS, counterattacked June 7th, 8th and 9th, barring the road to Caen to British and Canadians. They also set up defences outside the city, making bombing raids on Caen itself ineffective, though they allowed German propaganda to show their soldiers suffering the same fate as inhabitants. The German army maintained city control while for first refugees, the liberators' approach meant leaving. German counterattack also isolated Allied paratrooper divisions. Often dropping at imprecise locations, they couldn't link up with comrades advancing from the sea. Many were recaptured, but few seemed resigned to their fate. American airborne troops lost over half their equipment and 1 in 5 men. All paid dearly for the honor of being first to tread French soil, but their wide dispersion kept Germans confused, making them believe far greater numbers had been dropped than in reality. Now it was the 81st Airborne's turn to be laid to rest, before comrades paid final tribute.
Ready, aim, fire!
June 9th, Americans captured the small town of Isigny, furiously bombarded to drive Germans out for good. German defense of Isigny prevented Omaha forces from linking with those from Utah and continuing together towards Cherbourg. With Isigny taken, the Allied front reunited and stretched over 60 miles from Ouistreham to the Cotentin beachhead. Beyond the rubble, where were Isigny inhabitants looking? Perhaps toward the sea where a French ship finally crossed the channel. With allies firmly established along coasts, time to bring in General de Gaulle, leader of the provisional French government. Charles de Gaulle never liked needing help, and stepping onto French soil at Courseulles after 4 years' exile was no exception. The day before, Churchill, still distrustful, had written Montgomery, "I must inflict on you a visit from General de Gaulle.
I don't think you should greet him on the beach.
It'd be sufficient for him to arrive at your headquarters." De Gaulle would spend only 1 day in France. For him, too, time was pressing. Time to tell Montgomery what he wanted to hear, and the British Field Marshal even let him hog the limelight. Monty gave Norman Johnson, his own cameraman, the task of following de Gaulle, possibly to keep an eye on him. Though used to working to his leader's whims, Johnson thought de Gaulle was a good story. It was hard to follow him, he said, but luckily he was tall. He always had the same serious expression, but he did create good atmosphere. He always ignored the camera, or at least pretended to. In short, a star in the making. In Bayeux, people everywhere delighted to finally see Frenchmen not under German yoke, a sign of renewed sovereignty, especially as de Gaulle was intent on showing himself with his own people and resistance men and women, no British or Americans present, before heading to the town hall where he installed his men without referring to the Allies. He denied them any say in France's political choices and forced them to recognize his power in the country. Though men didn't need ports to land, They now needed artificial ports to continue battle and provide logistics and supplies for hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers. Every day, 150 to 200 ships unloaded some 7,000 vehicles, 15,000 tons of supplies, and thousands of men at Arromanches port on the British side and Omaha port on the American side. Soon, weather worsened,
again threatening to compromise the operation.
Normandy hadn't seen such a storm in 40 years. Inside anchorages, ships were tossed around like rag dolls. The caisson wall couldn't withstand the cataclysm. Worse, some broke away, letting waves surge into the port. Floating docks and gangplanks detached and swept away like flotsam. The storm lasted 4 full days, interrupting supply of materials and reinforcements. Morning of June 23rd, clear skies revealed the sorry sight of hundreds of ships and wrecks run aground along beaches. Though British engineers quickly rebuilt Arromanches port, the US port of Omaha remained out of commission. The plan was running 10 days late. US troops had to capture Cherbourg's deep water port as quickly as possible. Though surrounded, the city remained in German hands. Finally, June 26th, US infantry entered the suburbs. That same day, before gathered press he clearly didn't appreciate, Lieutenant General von Schlieben, garrison commandant, surrendered. Though this giant of a man politely wiped his feet before his victor, young General Collins, he nonetheless balked on his oath to Hitler to prefer death over surrender's shame. Schlieben even surrendered before his men, who didn't lay down weapons until the following day. Americans weren't always easy on prisoners, which is understandable. Since D-Day, they'd already lost 22,000 men, prisoners' average age. Some old, some very young showed German army decline in the west, while younger, battle-hardened troops deployed in the east, fighting the Red Army. 36,000 prisoners at Cherbourg,
A huge number. With Cherbourg taken, one of the Atlantic Wall's last sections had crumbled.
Unlike their men's faces, captured officers maintained a degree of haughtiness. Or was it shame? After Cherbourg, Hitler decided to personally oversee the German army in the west. He removed von Rundstedt, who'd suggested calling a truce, replacing him with more obliging Field Marshal von Kluge. Rommel, dismayed by the Führer's hardline policies, knew all he could do now was delay ultimate disaster. Meanwhile, Eisenhower was also worried. Yes, Americans had taken Cherbourg, but Montgomery had yet to capture Caen, the planned launch pad for attacking German lines. Installed inland, the German army had the advantage of space and possibilities of supplies and reinforcements, whereas Allies remained hemmed in along the Channel coast. Americans had no choice but to pierce the enemy front in the Cotentin. Not easy in bocage country where hedgerows made defense easier. To see without being seen, a big advantage for the enemy in battle none of the American youngsters were prepared for. In this huge checkerboard maze, a handful of resilient combatants could stop an entire battalion. When they conceded one square field, they simply came back around the sides. American tanks were obliged to stick to roads, making them easy targets, just as when they had to cross levees, openly presenting their unarmored bellies to enemy fire. These bocage traps accounted for thousands of GI lives and resulted in failed attempts to penetrate what became known as this goddamn country. With Americans in difficulty, British simply had to capture Caen. Montgomery finally decided to employ considerable means, asking for RAF backup. Over 2,500 tons of bombs were dropped on the city. After 2 days of fierce combat, 115,000 British troops entered east of the city, now 3/4 destroyed. July 13th, Montgomery arrived in the city. It had taken over a month to capture only part of Caen, a city he'd hoped to take in one day. Clearly in the kingdom of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. Though inhabitants raised the cross of Lorraine flag, much of the city remained in German hands. That didn't prevent the British propaganda machine from making people believe inhabitants and British troops were happy to drink a toast together. Was such intensive bombing and the 2,000 deaths it caused when German defences were placed around the city really necessary? The debate still rages, each person reacted in their own way. Who was this German playing organ in a ruined Normandy church?
A madman, a filthy Jerry, a music lover?
Or a lost soldier of Hitler, now weighed down by his leader's excesses, simply enjoying a moment's escape from this Holocaust scenery? Days later, Winston Churchill's turned to land. He wanted to check operations in the Caen sector personally. However much Montgomery played good tour guide, he only dominated his car, not the plain of Caen, still under German army control. 10 days after taking the city, the British were yet to break through German lines, and Churchill's agitation wasn't about to change that. For Eisenhower, who'd hoped for breakthrough in this sector, it was total failure considering huge means deployed. The Supreme Commander placed more trust in the discreet 3-star general, Omar Bradley, who'd organized the Omaha and Utah landings before taking Cherbourg. Eisenhower appreciated his calm, clear-headedness and effectiveness. Bradley thought Americans could break through enemy lines in the Cotentin. The operation code word, Cobra, like a snake that leans back then goes for the jugular. To help his men escape bocage country, Bradley planned to crush German positions on the front line with precision bombing raids. Once the breach was made, his troops would simultaneously advance on Brittany, the Seine, and the Loire. July 25th, Allied bombers attacked the road between Saint-Lô and Perrier where the two armies faced off. The famous armoured division of General Lair, Rommel's second-in-command, was wiped out. American troops could finally leave the hell of the bocage and force the breakout. It was the long-awaited breach in the enemy's front line. Moreover, seeing the numbers who surrendered, they made a good catch, even if many in the net were only small fry. In the bestiary that Normandy had become, tanks were fitted with blades to cut down hedgerows and cross the last miles of bocage. Even before July ended, once the breach was achieved, American armoured divisions reached Coutances, Avranches and Granville, the last ports in Normandy before Brittany. Early August, the 2nd French Armoured Division landed at Utah Beach. For months, even years, these Frenchmen had left everything behind to fight Germans and Italians in North Africa. Only this time, they were ready to arrive as victors on their beloved French soil. Leading them was General Leclerc, thin as his cane but valorous and upright. This aristocrat had all the attributes to have sided with Vichy, but he chose to follow de Gaulle as early as June 1940. Now he was landing as his homeland's liberator. His division was integrated into the American Third Army, with which he'd finally take part in operations on French soil, General Bradley's headquarters. Before the lens of American filmmaker George Stevens, Montgomery, always camera-aware, decorated a handful of Yankee soldiers. That was something he was good at. Under pressure from Eisenhower, the British Field Marshal had agreed to leave organization of the final battle to the Americans. For successful outcome, Bradley was also counting on a certain General Patton. The man who wore a Colt 45 in his holster was a go-getter. "At the first fart, they expect me to get them out of their shit," he was famously quoted as saying. And just as well. At dawn, Germans tried a last throw of the dice. From the plain of Caen, they launched a counter-offensive on Mortain, hoping to drive Allies back to the sea. The attack, planned personally by Hitler, was soon curbed by rockets launched from Allied Typhoons. It had no chance of success, von Kluge would write before taking his own life. It would be the last German offensive in the West. Worse still for Germans, at Mortain, Bradley had willfully allowed the enemy to make inroads into the Allied flank. Now they were trapped by Americans to the south and British to the north. Bradley would finally execute the maneuver he'd been planning, catch the enemy in a pincer movement between British divisions advancing from the plain of Caen and US armies in the south, trapping retreating Germans between Argenton and Falaise. As soon as the German counter-offensive was stopped at Mortain, Patton and his divisions headed to Le Mans in the direction of Paris. But some suddenly turned toward Argenton and made a wide, sweeping movement that encircled the Germans. While in the north, Anglo-Canadians formed the linchpin between the Allies, the German army was annihilated. Eisenhower later called the battlefield at Falaise the biggest bloodbath any war zone had ever known. He added that only Dante could have been capable of describing it. For hundreds of yards without interruption, he stepped over dead and rotting flesh. Between 5,000 and 6,000 Germans were killed. From the look of those taken prisoner, it seems Ike wasn't exaggerating. It would take several days to evacuate the 30 to 40,000 prisoners of war from Falaise. For them, captivity was a victory, that of life over death. The German army had mobilized men from countries it occupied. Not all were prepared to defend the Third Reich with their lives. The German army was finished in Normandy. With the Battle of Falaise won and prisoners dispatched, Patton's armies crossed the Seine and Loire. Eisenhower had now attained the two geographical limits established in Operation Overlord. Now he wanted to move on to the next step, the push toward Germany itself. August 19th, a blanket of smoke hung over Paris. On the ground, with news of the Allies' approach, the city had risen up. It was the German army itself which decided to abandon the French capital. Seen from above, convoy after convoy left Paris heading east without caring about barricades in the way. Footage of a real-life event that lives long in memory. 5 Germans in flames. It takes nothing away from the men and women who rose up against occupiers before the Allies' arrival and the dozens who died fighting the retreating German army. The next day, de Gaulle showed up at Eisenhower's headquarters. Ike wanted to avoid turning Paris into another battlefield. He preferred to surround the capital, forcing Germans to surrender and pick the city like ripe fruit. But the eloquent French leader managed to persuade Eisenhower to enter the city to avoid possible bloodbath, but also to quash the rise of communist resistance members. Ike yielded, and Bradley agreed to detach Leclerc's 2nd Armored Division, which had won renown at Falaise, so it'd be the first unit into Paris and would accept German surrender. After several fierce battles south of the capital, the suburb sky turned blue. Women wore red and men sported white shirts, forming a tricolour world to welcome Leclerc's boys at Paris gates. Now in the city itself, time for jubilation. On that day, the gamble of the man who'd appealed to the French people back on June 18, 1940, had paid off. The miracle had happened. France, once crushed and humiliated, now stood shoulder to shoulder with the victors, now for the victory parade down the Champs-Élysées to reinforce the legend, but that's a very French story. Our story ends the following day on a less magical Place de la Concorde. At the head of a country whose political future was still uncertain, de Gaulle had asked Eisenhower to back his authority before the French people. Eisenhower happily obliged, as did General Bradley. But it was modesty alone that kept him in the background as de Gaulle took centre. Staged, Eisenhower was intent on holding a march past of U.S. troops who would continue the fight against the Third Reich. Americans astutely knew that in the post-war period, when the world would be politically divided, they needed France on their side in Europe. This story has been high in colour, but the original images are often in black and white. In the end, whether in colour or black and white, each piece of footage tells about the fate of all those men who took part in the Normandy landings. So many of them anonymous amongst the massed troops. Who were you lost amongst the crowd of faces? Or you turning around? From the young paratroopers who blackened their faces with charcoal, knowing half wouldn't survive, to Sergeant O'Neill, the 20-year-old cameraman who took a bullet filming his brothers in arms on Sword Beach, from Robert Capa lying in vomit as shells screamed overhead at Bloody Omaha, to the 3,000 Americans who died there in a single day, their bodies washing in the red tide. From the Canadians who travelled 5,000 miles to liberate a small seaside resort called Bernières, 300 of them never leaving, to Norman Clague, the cameraman with just a clapperboard who filmed German prisoners with compassion days before German fire killed him, from Sergeant Ian Grant in his Scottish beret, fighting seasickness and diesel fumes as the sky turned black with planes, to the nameless German playing organ in a ruined church, seeking brief escape from the Holocaust around him, from Rommel, the desert fox who knew he could only delay disaster, to the young soldiers of the Hitler Jugend SS who died defending a cause already lost, from the French resistance fighters who endured brutal repression to provide intelligence that saved Allied lives, to the 4,000 French civilians killed by the very bombs meant to liberate them. From Eisenhower writing his letter of resignation in case of failure, taking all blame upon himself, to Montgomery, who took over a month to capture a city he'd promised in a day, from Churchill with his cigar and camera, watching his nation's youth prepare to storm beaches, to Bradley, the quiet three-star general whose Cobra strike finally broke the German stranglehold, from Patton with his Colt 45, ready to pull everyone out of the shit, to Leclerc, the French aristocrat who chose de Gaulle over Vichy and lived to liberate his homeland, from the British sappers who rebuilt Arromanches port after the worst storm in 40 years, to the American medics who treated enemy wounded even as their own comrades bled out in the sand, from the boys from Utah, Kansas, Ohio, and Kentucky who couldn't find France on a map, to the British lads from small grey towns who'd spent 4 years resisting the Nazis, from the inflatable airplanes meant to fool German reconnaissance, to the Phoenix caissons that would be sunk to form artificial harbours, from the French women delighted to see liberators who spoke their language with funny accents, to the British girls in Blackpool whose absent husbands would return to find their marriages dissolved. They were all there on those beaches, in those hedgerows, in that bocage maze that became known as this goddamn country. They were there when the Atlantic Wall, built with 13 million tons of concrete and the slave labor of thousands, finally crumbled. They were there when von Schlieben, the giant German commandant, politely wiped his feet before surrendering Cherbourg. They were there at Falaise, where Eisenhower said only Dante could describe the carnage, where for hundreds of yards you could only step on dead and rotting flesh. They were the anonymous heroes of the greatest amphibious invasion in human history, the day 7,000 vessels and 20,000 aircraft converged on a 50-mile stretch of French coastline, the day 130,000 men crossed the Channel, knowing many wouldn't see another sunrise, the day that would cost 10,500 Allied lives and nearly as many German, but would ultimately open the road to Berlin and end the Third Reich's reign of terror. Some of them made it home. Some of them lie still in the cemeteries of Normandy, forever 20 years old. Some of them were captured in black and white by men like Grant and O'Neill and Clague, preserved in film that would outlive them all. Some of them were never photographed, never named, never remembered by anyone but the comrades who fought beside them. But they were all there on June 6, 1944, and the days and weeks that followed. They were all part of the greatest and most crucial test their generation would ever face. And whether they survived or not, whether they were remembered or forgotten, whether they were heroes or simply scared young men doing what they were told, they all deserve the same 2 words. Thank you.